I'm Joshua Bardwell, and this is part 2 of my review of the Foxeer Legend 3 action camera. If you haven't seen part 1, it goes over the features and specs of the camera and compares the specs to the GoPro Hero5 Session and Hero4 Session. In this video, you're going to get what many of you, I think, were hoping for in the first place, and that is the actual flight footage. See how they stack up. We're going to look at 4K footage, 2.7K footage, 1080p footage, 60 frames per second, the whole rigmarole. And we're going to find out whether the specs of the Legend, which in some ways were inferior to the specs of the Hero5 Session, like for example, it uses lower bit rates. We're going to see how those manifest in actual image quality, because numbers on paper are not the be-all end-all of a product's performance. One thing I need to tell you before we get into the video is that this video has been uploaded in 4K resolution, and of course it has. It's a 4K action camera. Wouldn't be much of a review if I didn't show you some 4K footage. But if you're only watching at 1080p, you're not going to see the full benefit of the 4K resolution. The bottom line is that you need to think about what resolution you've got selected in the lower right-hand menu in the YouTube gear icon and how that interacts with the screen. That if you're watching on your cell phone, that's not the best way to view this content, okay? How that all interacts, yada, yada, yada. Let's get into the video. Now let's take a look at some flight footage from these cameras, and normally I would not tell you which was which in order to preserve the unbiased nature of the results, but I have a feeling most of you are going to recognize the sort of hyper-saturated blue colors of the Legend versus the more muted colors of the GoPro. So I'll just leave it to you to try and be as objective as you can. And we'll start by just looking at this static scene so you can get a sense for how the cameras choose color and exposure. The GoPro is set to auto color. We're not using ProTune here, and I haven't done any grading in post. We've been looking at the Foxeer Legend 3 up till now. Let's take a look at the GoPro. The first thing that jumps out to me when I look at the GoPro is that it seems to have a lot less sharpening. I've got the GoPro's sharpening turned down to the lowest level, and the same for the Foxeer Legend. This is not how they come by default, but it is a recommended setting, especially if you're going to be uploaded to YouTube. It makes the picture softer, and the softer picture with less edge detail is easier for the encoder to work with, especially with fast motion. You're maybe not going to notice the extra sharpening anyway. But here, if you look at the blades of grass, for example, you don't see as much edge detail, and if you look at the trees in the distance, look at the trees in the distance on the GoPro, and now the Legend. You notice you can see a lot more apparent detail in the trees in the distance there. I think it's a matter of some subjectivity which of these you're going to like better. You might feel that, well, the higher resolution picture, well, it's not higher resolution, by the way. They're both, this is 1080p 60 on both of them. But you might feel that the additional detail in the Legend is desirable. On the other hand, you might feel that the softer picture looks more, I don't know, better, more natural, you know, less sort of grainy, less, I don't know, you might like that look better. Continue to pay attention to this as we get moving. We'll be looking at both still frames and moving video. The other thing that jumps out, and this is very, very common, is you see that the white balance algorithm for the GoPro has chosen a warmer white balance. It is a redder color, whereas if we look at the Legend, it is cooler. It is a bluer color. That is certainly something you can try to adjust in post, but it's a matter of some subjectivity, which you like better. Personally, I prefer the warmer look of the GoPro to the cooler look of the Legend. And this is something that I've seen ever since going back all the way back through to the Mobius. They all seem to have a pretty blue auto. I don't know why they do it that way, but there you go. There's one more thing that jumps out before we get to the flight video, and that is the way that they're implementing Super View. If you look at the center of this frame, look at approximately the center 1/3 of this frame, there is that tree in the middle. Look at about how skinny it is, and also look at the cloud that's almost dead center. And now let's go look at how that looks on the Legend. Do you see the difference? Do you see that they're wider? It almost looks to me like the quote-unquote Super View on the Legend is just stretching the entire image, as opposed to doing what the GoPro does, where it stretches only the edges of the image, leaving the center untouched. If you look at things in the very center of the image, you can see that it's basically the whole image appears stretched, and it just looks like they've just done a linear stretch across the whole thing. And that, of course, is not going to look as good as stretching just the edges, at least in my mind. Well, okay, let's take a look at some flying, and I'm just going to go back and forth for you while we fly. Now let's take a minute to focus in on some of the things that I noticed while I watched this footage, and suffice it to say, I've watched this footage more than a few times. I want you to notice that we're in the Premiere playback window here. I'm doing that because it'll make it easy for me to switch back and forth and slide around in the footage. And we're looking at full resolution. And what I'm going to do is instead of fitting the image to my screen, you can see this is not full screen. I'm going to go to 100% zoom, and what that means is it's going to fill the screen. We're not going to see the entire screen all at once because we're not full screen, but it guarantees that there won't be any artifacts caused by resizing or anything like that. So here we are looking at the GoPro, and if I now switch to the Legend, you can see that sharpening it's really everywhere in the footage. The GoPro is much blurrier. Now there's an interesting question as to whether this relates to the shutter speed of the GoPro and whether it's just more motion blur. And I really don't think it is. I think this is a post-processing thing that the Legend is doing. It's doing sharpening. Bear in mind, both of these are set on their lowest sharpening setting, which you could try turning the sharpening up in the GoPro. But I've found that this actually doesn't look as good when you put it up on YouTube, because all this extra detail here, actually YouTube really chokes on it. So when you're looking at these still frames that you're seeing now, compare them to how the Legend looked previously. It looks great on my screen, but I'm willing to bet that when it gets uploaded to YouTube and re-encoded and garbled, the Legend isn't going to look as good. All this extra detail that the Legend is showing, the bitrate that YouTube chooses is going to choke on it. That being said, I questioned whether the Legend's bitrate was enough. I think the Legend uses 16 megabits per second for 1080p 30, and I think 30 megabits per second for 1080p 60, compared to 45 megabits per second for the GoPro. And I said, well, that's 15 fewer megabits per second, so I expect the Legend to not be as good, but I gotta say, it's doing great. If we just look through the Legend, assuming you don't mind that sort of hyper sharp bit that it's got, it's really doing quite a good job. Here's the Legend. Here's the GoPro. The GoPro is also darker. Now that's just an exposure choice that the GoPro is making, and certainly we could change that exposure in post, but the GoPro is certainly darker and definitely has less detail. I especially notice it here when you've got these leaves on the ground. The leaves really pop out in the Legend, whereas in the GoPro, they just don't pop out quite as much. This is a scene that also really highlights the difference between them. Just look at all the detail you can see here in the Legend. Just the leaves and the mesh here, you can see every little last bit of the detail, whereas on the GoPro, it's definitely a lot muddier. However, I'm not convinced that that looks better on the Legend when you're actually watching it play back in real time. And I'm not going to do that here because my screen capture utility is not capturing at the full frame rate. But if you go back and want to watch it, you can try and compare and contrast. I'm not convinced that it actually looks better when you're actually watching the playback. It certainly looks great in the still frames though. The next thing we're going to look at is the 2.7K 30 frame per second super view footage. And I'll let you look at it before I make my comments. Now we'll do the same detailed look. Once again, we're back in Premiere, and once again, I'm going to set it to 100% resolution, and it's going to zoom in. So we'll be seeing even less of the frame now because it's a 2.7K frame, but it really will let us see all of the detail. And one of the things I want to look for is how the bitrate is holding up to the increased resolution. So for example, we can look at the GoPro right now, and we can look in the background and see how much detail it was able to capture here in this mesh netting. And if we then go to the Legend, you can see that the Legend, it's sharper, and as we saw with 1080, it's sharper, but also the bitrate does seem to be holding up. We're not seeing a ton of blocking or loss of detail here. We are seeing that detail still come out. So whatever Foxeer seems to be doing with their bits per second and their encoder, it seems to be holding on just fine. Here we go. We've got, again, look at the detail off in the distance here. How much detail is the Legend able to capture? And here, whereas the GoPro, well, yeah, significantly less. And who knows why that is, whether that's frame rate, or I don't think it's frame rate, because this is not moving very much. So I don't know what it is, but it seems like the bit rate that the Legend is using, even though it's less than what the GoPro is using, it seems to be doing a pretty good job with the images. One of the things I noticed in my GoPro videos, my series of videos on GoPro settings, was that as you're flying, you'll start to see the grass kind of lose detail and lose resolution off into the distance. Up close to the camera, it can be relatively sharp, and then if you don't have enough bitrate, it just becomes a really muddy mess. And wow, yeah, that's a particularly poor example here. Yeah. It's very interesting. So the Legend seems to be doing just fine with its bitrate, I guess is what I'm saying. 2.7K on the Legend. Does it look better than 1080? Well, we haven't done that head-to-head, but 2.7K certainly is holding up. For this last test, I've got the GoPro at 2.7K 30 frame per second super view, and I have the Legend at 4K 25 frame per second super view. So the idea here is that I already established that the GoPro looks worse at 4K than it does at 2.7K, and the GoPro can't do super view at 4K, so we can't really do a head-to-head 4K comparison, so let's do, well, the closest we can get. Now this one I think is really interesting because, as I said before, the GoPro at 4K was just not able to really keep up with the bitrate. The encoder couldn't do a great job with fast motion. So how did the Legend do? And right now we are looking at the Legend, and this image. Now this is resized down to 1080p, and actually smaller than 1080p even, because this is not full screen. So if we compare this to the GoPro at 2.7 4K, it looks pretty decent. If we look here in the sort of middle ground where the image will usually get blocky if you don't have enough bitrate, it looks reasonably sharp. Don't see a lot of encoding artifacts. Let's just find some other examples here. Here, like for example, where the grass out here starts to lose detail, we don't see, it looks really good. The transition from the detail up close to the far off looks pretty good. And here's the GoPro. GoPro also looks pretty good here. Now, but this is having them zoomed all the way out and resized to be smaller. If we then take them to 100% resolution, what do we see? Here is the Legend and the GoPro. Now we can certainly see that the GoPro has less resolution. For example, if we look at this guy here on the GoPro, he's definitely sharper in the Legend. And right here we can see this is a person standing. Let's look at that in the GoPro. Definitely less resolution. So what we're seeing here is that we definitely are getting more resolution going to 4K out of the Legend than the GoPro at 2.7. And that's what you would expect. But if the encoder wasn't tuned correctly, if the bitrate was not adequate, then we would get more pixels but less actual functional resolution. That's not what we're seeing. We are getting more functional resolution. And that's pretty darn impressive, actually. This is the GoPro. Let's take a look right here at this mesh. Yeah. Now, I do notice, like right here, take a look here, and in fact, I'll go zoom into 200% real quick, and we'll take an even closer look. I'm not convinced that 4K on the Legend is actually better than 2.7, and the reason is, like, if you look at how this has kind of gotten distorted, I think that I see more of that kind of distortion with the Legend at 4K than at 2.7. So although there seems to be some benefit to 4K on the Legend, which I concluded there wasn't with the GoPro, that kind of distortion that we see, almost like I don't know what the word for it is, but you see it here, for example, kind of a smearing there. I don't know. I'm still not sure that I like 4K better, but it certainly does provide more resolution under some circumstances. Like, I wonder how this would look in 2.7K. I think it might look better. So that's pretty comparable, going between the GoPro at 2.7K and the Legend at 4K. That's actually pretty comparable, and we can see kind of a smearing here in the tree, whereas on the GoPro, the whole thing is a little bit blurry, but there is no smearing, that artifacting there. With that all said and done, here are my conclusions. I'm really impressed with the Legend 3. It exceeded I expected less from it than I got. For example, when I tested the GoPro Hero5 Session, one of the things I found was that at 1080p, the image quality was not good enough for my standards. And that's true when you upload it to YouTube, and YouTube destroys the image quality, but it's also true of the raw files that the GoPro spits out. And so I run my GoPro at 2.7K, because that's where I feel like the sweet spot is for image quality. However, it does mean I can't run at 60 frames per second, and it means that I use up a lot more space on my SD card than if I was running at 1080p. Whereas the Legend 3, I feel like the 1080p footage is perfectly acceptable, and I might run 1080p 60 if the Legend 3 is my primary camera. I'm not really sure what the Legend 3 is doing differently than the GoPro. The GoPro in every case has more bits per second, from between 45 and 60 megabits per second, whereas the Legend 3 is sometimes down as low as 16 or 30 and only hits 60 megabits per second at the very highest resolutions. Nevertheless, I feel like in every case, the Legend 3's image quality held up against the GoPro. I say held up. There's some subjectivity to that, because in every case, the Legend 3 had sharper images, even though the sharpening was at its minimum setting. I shudder to think what the Legend 3 would look like on its maximum sharpening setting. You may not like that sharper image. You may prefer a more blurry and more motion blurred image, especially for action sports. But if you like the kind of image the Legend 3 puts out, it does a pretty solid job of putting out that type of image, and I think that's just a matter of your preference. I was also impressed with the microphone on the Legend 3. In fact, in many cases, I felt like it sounded better than the GoPro. The GoPro seems to roll off the high frequencies a lot more, whereas the Legend 3 lets the high frequencies through, and so the sound doesn't sound as muffled from the Legend 3. However, there were times when the Legend 3 let a lot more wind noise through, depending on sort of how the camera was facing relative to the wind, whereas the GoPro does a more consistent job of keeping a consistently muffled sound, but it's at least consistent, whereas the Legend, it sounded, I think, better much of the time, but then some of the time it sounded worse. So I'll give the mic on the Legend 3 a kind of a provisional pass. I could live with it. Whereas if you compare that to like the mic on the Runcam 3, it was terrible and I couldn't live with it. I'd never use it. The Legend 3 does leave a few things to be desired. One of them is that it doesn't have an equivalent of a ProTune flat mode, and that would be nice. It does have pretty good default exposure algorithms. It does the best it can. It overexposed a little bit compared to the GoPro, although you could certainly fix that by just turning the exposure compensation down. But overall, I was not dissatisfied with the results. If I did want to tweak it in post, though, I would have less ability to do that. So if you're the kind of person who really wants to do the tweaking in post, you really do want the ProTune flat out of the GoPro. So then the question is, if the Legend 3 is so darn freaking good, am I going to switch to it? Am I going to stop using the GoPro Hero5 Session and start using the Legend 3? And I think the answer to that is no. Despite all of the glowing things I've said about the Legend 3, I still feel like I like the image out of the GoPro better. And I couldn't point to any one thing that does that. I like the softer image better, especially for fast motion. I like the way the GoPro handles color temperature. And I like the ability to have ProTune flat for post processing, although I did poo-poo that in an earlier video. I've really come around to liking it a lot. And I like the mic. I don't know. Maybe I like the Legend's mic better. Okay, fine. But I think I'm going to stick to the GoPro for now, even though the Legend has a lot going for it. But that's easy for me to say. I have a moderately popular YouTube channel, and I can kind of justify the purchase of a GoPro as a business expense. If I didn't have that justification, I would probably rather buy 2 of the Legend 3 compared to 1 GoPro. And I feel like at $150, the Legend 3 is absolutely worth buying if that's where your budget falls. I feel like, in fact, compared to the Runcam 3 for $99, the Legend 3 is a better purchase, although it doesn't have that cube form factor. Although now the Runcam 3 kind of can't purchase it everywhere, so maybe that's a good thing. And with all that, we are now finally at the end of this extensive video. I hope you found this educational. I hope it helped you decide whether the Legend 3 was the right camera for you to buy. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments. There are links to the raw videos in the video description. And as always, happy flying.